there. I'm glad you could make it today. We've got a story coming from the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 14, in case you want to follow along or look this up later on. All right, the last lesson had to do with the Tower of Babel, and now the book of Genesis is taking a turn going from a generalized view of what's going on to going into lives of specific people. And this is where we're introduced to Abram and Sarai. Now, their names are later going to be changed to Abraham and Sarah. And since that's the way most people know them, that's the way I'm going to refer to them from here on. But it's a while in these actual chapters before their names do get changed. So I do want you to know that. All right, what we have is Abraham and Sarah were married to each other. They lived in this area called Haran or Ur. There were a couple of spots that they lived in that time. The main thing for you to know is that this was a good distance away from where they're going to live, because God speaks to Abraham and says, all right, here's what I want you to do is pick up everything you've got and move to a land I'm going to show you, and you are going to make a great nation. All right, well, a couple of things about this is that we use the terms country and nation kind of interchangeably, like they mean the same thing, but that's really not true. Country has to do with a place and a setup of the people who live in that place. A nation is an actual group of people who are bound together by one thing or another, either because they live within the borders of a country or because they're descended from the same person or something like that. So, what God is talking about is a nation, meaning a group of people. So this is interesting to Abraham because at the time this happens, Abraham is 75 years old and Sarah is 65 years old. And even though people lived longer back then, they would have been considered getting on up there in age. And the problem Abraham would have immediately noticed is that he and Sarah don't have any children. In fact, she has been unable to have any children. So he wonders about that, but he believes God. And so he packs up everything and leaves. Now, it's not just the two of them, because Abraham has a nephew named Lot who wants to go with him. Now, Lot is grown up, but the situation is that Lot's father had already died. And what I get from this is that he looked on Abraham kind of like his new dad, and he wanted to be with him. In any event, he wants to go. And it's not just the three of them. Of course, they're animals that they have in which most of their wealth is contained. But there are also a lot of servants, um, whether they are slaves or whether they are people who are just hired on. They consider themselves part of Abraham's um, group, and they're going along as well. Now, an interesting thing later on, we find out that Abraham has 318 trained men, and that likely would have been men who had had some kind of military service because they know how to fight. And that gives us some insight into the fact that, hey, maybe Abraham took in these people after they were too old to continue their military duty, but were still able to work. All right, so they pick up and go, and it's quite some distance. We're talking like in the 500-mile range, and they get to this area, and it is in what we now think of as the promised land. This is what God has promised already, and God comes to Abraham. Well, he sets up an altar there, and then they keep traveling, They get to another part of the area, and same thing. God speaks to Abraham. This is part of the land, and Abraham sets up another altar to God. They didn't have the tabernacle or a temple back then, so they would just build altars to God wherever they happened to come across them. And we also find out that there are already people living there. But Abraham does not see this as a situation where he is supposed to go in and conquer the land. He actually believes God, who tells him that I'm going to give you this land. Okay, so that's pretty good with Abraham. And they lived there for a while, and because they have so many animals, they don't really hang around in towns and cities. There's really nothing useful for them there. They're out in the countryside. Well, a famine comes along, and my guess is that it had a lot to do with drought, because drought can lead to famine, meaning it's not raining, so crops are not growing, grass is not growing. Because Abraham has a lot of animals, and so we find that he and Sarah and Lot leave the area and they go to Egypt. Now, Egypt is in a good position, even though most of the country is desert. They have the river Nile, which runs through and keeps things green to some extent on both sides of the Nile. So there's always a source of water there. And the Egyptians have their own empire with their own king, whom they call Pharaoh. So anytime you have an Egyptian king, you may hear the word Pharaoh, and that's what it means. And I really like to use that term, because it's kind of a reminder that a king in those days just might be the head of a small town. But when you're talking about Pharaoh, you're talking about somebody who controls a huge area. So as they're getting there, Abraham shows some fear, and he tells Sarah, now, when we get there, don't tell anyone I'm your husband, because you're a beautiful woman, and if they think I'm your husband, or if they find out I'm your husband, they'll kill me, and Pharaoh will marry you, or somebody will anyway. So he's not trusting God at this point to keep him safe, and we can wonder about that, but we really don't have an answer on this. Now, Abraham was probably right if God had not been with him, but with God telling him what to do, it seems like he lacked as much faith as we want to give him credit for. But let's not be too hard on him, because he did not have the Bible like we do in order to go back and check things out. All right, so they get there, and it turns out he's not just thinking Sarah's beautiful because he loves her. She really is beautiful. And the pharaohs tended to be attracted to beautiful foreign women. And that's what Sarah is. So Pharaoh finds out about her, sees her for himself, and he makes Sarah one of his own wives. So we can see a problem with that already, because she's already married, but Pharaoh doesn't know this. And as a result, thinking that Abraham is her brother, then he gives Abraham lots of presents, meaning more animals, more servants, and even silver and gold. So even though money was pretty rare back then, most people counted their value in their animals that they owned. There was silver and gold that was considered valuable, and this was one case way back in the Old Testament where people have it in addition to the animals and maybe lands that they have. All right, well, God begins punishing Pharaoh and the people around him with diseases, because he doesn't like this whole idea of Sarah being married off to Pharaoh. Well, somehow Pharaoh finds out, and I got a feeling that Sarah probably brought this up at some point. He goes to Abraham and he said, "Why did you tell me that this was your sister? You should have told me it was your wife." And so he's wanting to get rid of these folks and have the diseases stop. And so he gives Sarah back, and makes it in Abraham's interest for them to head back to where they had come from. And in this case, it's the land of Canaan. The Canaanites are still living there, along with lots of other groups. They get back there. I guess the famine is over by now, because what we find is that Lot has a huge number of animals, Abraham has a huge number of animals, and there's not enough grass in the area for both of them. And the guys that they have in their households who are taking care of the animals and eating them to feed are pretty angry at each other because they can't find enough grass. So Abraham gets together with Lot and says, okay, let's not have any trouble between us. Let's sort of divide up the area. And if you want to take the east, I'll take the west. If you want the west, I'll take the east. If you want the north, I'll take the south. If you want the south, I'll take the north. So he's really saying, just, pick out where you want to go, and you take that, and I'll take somewhere else. So pretty smart move. And it turns out to have some interesting consequences in it, because Lot looks off to the east and he sees there's this valley. There are towns of Sodom and Gomorrah and some other places, and there's a valley with water in there, and it's a good place with lots of grass. And he goes, okay, that's where I want. And Abraham says, fine. So Lot heads off, and we don't know a whole lot of what happens over the next few years, but here's what happens with Abraham. He goes in the other direction, off to the west, and things are fine. There are no problems. Meanwhile, the Bible tells us that Sodom was a wicked city, and the people did not do things that God liked. In fact, they did things God did not like. And this is kind of a foreshadowing, meaning telling us ahead that, okay, just keep this in mind. We're telling you this now, that this is happening, and you just wait. Now, we're not going to cover the story today, but we will later. So what you need to know is that Sodom is a bad place. And that is where Lot has gone to live in the area. He's not actually living in the city yet. And then we find out that Sodom and Gomorrah and 3 other cities in that area have their kings get together and decide that, we don't like paying tribute to these other kings. And there are 4 kings coming in. Well, these 4 kings end up bringing their armies together and coming in and fighting a lot of cities and beating them. And they're headed for Sodom and Gomorrah. The armies there move out, they combine, and they fight, and they lose. And as a result, the enemy kings are able to take over Sodom and Gomorrah, and they take people, they take their stuff, they really mess things up, and they head off. Well, somebody gets away and goes and tells Abraham. He takes his trained men, goes after them, catches up with them, and wins the battle. And he's able to rescue Lot, who was part of the people who were captured and taken off. And so Lot and his people are rescued. And we find out that at this point, Lot had moved into Sodom. All right. Abraham gives a tenth of what he owns to this priest who comes out named Melchizedek. And Melchizedek happens to be a priest of God. So he is showing proper honor. And the king of Sodom offers him some stuff, and Abraham says, no, I don't want you to be able to say you made me rich. You take everything. I'm not taking any of your stuff. And so king of Sodom goes back to Sodom. Lot goes with him. And Abraham goes back to where he's from. So at this point, everything looks fine, but it's not going to stay that way. All right, the lesson for today is God had told Abraham he's going to have a great nation that's uncountable like the stars. So I have my tie with stars on it. And come back next time and we'll see what happens next. Talk to you later.